So welcome to What Are Our Ethical Duties to Wildlife? A little overview of the panel. There's been a shift in the human perception of wildlife, and many people, many more than in the past, are starting to believe that wildlife should be able to live independent of humans. The shift has not been reflected in the legal system yet, and so that was sort of the concept of this panel. So we will be discussing here why the shift has taken place, why it's not being reflected in our legal system, what rights wildlife ought to have, and what those rights would look like if they were reflected in our legal system. So it is my honor to introduce two people that don't really need introduction at all, but I will anyways. First, we have Professor Paul Waldow. He is the lead faculty member at Anthrozoology graduate program at Canisius College. In spring 2012, he served as the Barker Visiting Associate Professor on Animal Law at Harvard Law School, where he has taught animal law since 2002. He's the former director of the Center for Animals and Public Policy. He taught veterinary ethics and public policy at Tufts University School of Veterinary Medicine for more than a decade. He's written 5 books, and he's the president of Religion and Animals Institute, a website that promotes education, discussion, and scholarship regarding the role that religion plays in our awareness of all living beings. Second, we have Professor David Favor. If you were at the banquet dinner, you've already heard a wonderful intro for him, but I will do a quick summary here. He's the professor of law and the Nancy Heathcote Professor of Property and Animal Law at Michigan State University. He teaches property, international environmental law, wildlife law, and animal law. He has written many articles and books dealing with various animal issues. He's also presented on these topics all over the world. He's a national officer of ALDF and on the ABA Committee on Animal Law. He's the editor-in-chief of the Animal Legal and Historical Center, the largest legal website devoted to animal issues. Many of you probably know it as animallaw.info. I know that's how we refer to it at Lewis and Clark. And he is the very recent recipient of the Animal Law Leadership Award. So without further ado, Professor Paul Waldow.
Good morning. It's a privilege not only to be on a panel with David, but to be his friend. And it's a true privilege. Thank you very much. My task here is to direct comments at the importance of noticing wildlife, and in particular in doing this in several different ways. And first of those ways is to notice wildlife in the sense of taking this large, very diverse category, often very strange group, seriously. And we do that by seeking out their actual realities, factoring those into the complexity of their lives as individuals and as members of their own communities. And those are rather extraordinary communities, as I hope we can discuss at some point. A second way we need to take notice of wildlife, notice them, take them seriously, is taking seriously our impacts on them, our thinking about them, and the prospects we have for sharing this earth with these other than human lives. The question that's posed in the panel's title, what are our ethical duties to wildlife, uses the familiar word ethical, but though we bandy about the word easily, often, if you go to Amazon, there's more than 100,000 books listed under the ethics search. It's not a simple word, not a simple concept. It's a word that can be used in strikingly diverse ways that, because it's a familiar term, may cause us to gloss over many important, altogether relevant features of this to law, to wildlife, to who we are. I want to foreground that this word, which is actually based on a Greek word, ethikos, which means customs, and its synonym is morals, morality, which is from the Latin morale. They mean customs, but of course we mean much more than mere customs. We really want to signal a remarkable set of abilities that each of us brought into the room with us this morning. It comes with humanity. It comes with different kinds of other sorts of mammals as well, and even perhaps some non-mammals. Typically, I use PowerPoints in every class I do, but I wanted to forego that here because I wanted to, in one sense, honor the way I've come to know the group here. My wife and I were talking last night. She said, gosh, you're sure energized, because it was a really wonderful set of panels. And I'm not so jaded that I don't get energized at conferences, but at the really good ones, I do get very energized, and I was extremely up because of the different panels yesterday. Also with some students, Mia is here, a former student who's, as we talked coming in, makes me so remarkably proud that I've been able to walk with her. Danny's here as well, and I know Danny as well, but it's really wonderful to see students come and become true colleagues. So I wanted to forego the PowerPoint in order to be more in conversation, because I think that's an important primate reality, an important social reality of how we look at ethics. This question of ethics is not a matter just of ideas, although we often talk about it. In the handout materials I've given you, I've given you, and I'm not going to go over that, some of the details of how we discuss this in many important circles. But it's really not ideas, it's a matter of life. Maybe it's better said, it's a matter of lives. Our human lives, of course, but also the other than human lives that we share this earth with. So ethics is a powerful, amazing, encompassing topic. Well, the abilities signaled by the word, either ethics or morality, they're by no means solely human. Scientific evidence and anecdotal evidence are profoundly deep and wide about how many animals have this fundamental ability to care. Quite widespread, it turns out, in the mammalian group. So it's a very important feature, but it's clearly a very special feature in us, something we grow up amidst and we bring into every room, as evidenced by every human culture that's ever existed. So not only are we social animals, but we're ethical animals as well. And the key feature of this, I think, is a practical side. Okay, so we're using academic terms, terms polished by scholarship, but there is something very practical or existential about what we're doing. And I like to frame that in terms of a simple question that we wake up to each day, go to sleep to each day. Who are the others I will choose to care about? Who are they? We have great capacities for this, so who are the others? Can't care about every single thing. We're finite, but we can care about a great deal. The supporting handout describes this as the root question of all ethics. But let's set aside that kind of an academic approach, as valuable as it might be. It helps us see the key dimension of life, but we're living it, and feeling it as we live it, I think, is the really key aspect of understanding what ethics is about. At its best, the academic approach helps us sort this kind of stuff out. But in practice, it gets caught up in jargon. It gets caught up in words like deontology or utilitarianism. Great. But this is about what we're bringing to each moment in our lives. So that's why I wanted to stay in plain conversation rather than in the more structured up PowerPoint, because it's so real, it's so personal, it's interactive, it's practical in our lives. I think something equally relevant is that despite the fact that this is a key human trait, and we need to work on it each day, we actually work amidst it every day, even if we don't notice it, it's often very poorly discussed. And sadly, it's deeply abused as well. It's dismissed in really important circles, in policy-making circles. In much contemporary law, where the stark dualism, legal persons, legal things, creates a starkly arid, uninviting universe of two parts. We're the privileged ones and everything else, legal things. It elevates human interests in an unrealistic way, and it ignores entirely non-human interests, even though we know in our daily lives that's not how humans live our lives, but nonetheless our law is out of touch with that fundamental feature. It's also a stark universe in the modern circles dominated by economics discussions. Policy is, as you'll know, formed inside of nations and across nations on highly economics-oriented terms these days. And it has a kind of thinking that often frames hurting humans or ignores hurting humans, but certainly non-humans as well. And in science circles, where people relentlessly use the division humans and animals, even though that's a very anti-scientific way of looking at the world, we know we're mammals, primates, chordates, etc. And yet we have a phrase in science, taught to science students, humans and animals. In effect, I work with biologists in a biology department, and I might say that there's a kind of cowardice in the face of reality there. Not really teaching what science requires us to say about our relationship to the other animals. Okay, consider how ethics has been living in this conference, though. Lots of the topics and solutions raised in one panel after another have been saturated with explicitly ethical themes. And when that's not been explicit, it's been implicit in virtually everything people suggested we should be doing. So that's an incredibly deep affirmation of the fact that we carry this with us, we talk to each other with it constantly. The goal, again, in these discussions has been, how do we stop the human-fostered harms? We're not always on about stopping other animals competing with each other in their natural state. Some people do care about that, but that's minimal compared to what we're doing intentionally for sometimes very petty, small human interests. Think of the ALDF videos theme, we're better than this, fundamentally human affirmation. And it models the foundational place of ethics in our lives. Even that impressive panel on factory farming. Okay, so it reminded us again and again, we live in a world where powerful forces are in denial of our connection to other animals, our ability to care about them. But plenty of the presenters came on to remind us, as Carter Diller did, for example, about the importance of other regarding, seeing others, or the way that Chris Green reminds us too, through the long list of legislative achievements, very specific ways that we other regard through law these days. So my point is that animal law is bringing us back to answering the root question of ethics, who are the others, which sits at the heart of each person all the time. It helps us recognize something that the marvelous psychotherapist Viktor Frankl once said. Listen carefully to this, it's a little jargonized, but it's a profoundly important human insight. Self-actualization is possible for a human only as a side effect of self-transcendence. Self-actualization follows only if you self-transcend. So, to wildlife. What's the role of wildlife in our self-actualization through self-transcendence? Well, one way is this. You can ask yourself in the morning, will the others that I care about today be only humans? Will they be only my own local family or friends? Will they be only the humans in my larger community? Will they be just my race, just my gender? Will they be just those who are in my religious tradition? Will they be just all humans? Or will it be some combination of human animals and non-human animals? We're perfectly capable of that. Every culture has proven that. Every religious tradition has deep resources for this, even if mainline forms of those religion are often in denial of that. Wildlife is clearly some of the others that we can care about. We certainly impact them. If we take responsibility for our actions, we ought to at least know what those harms we're doing are. That means knowing them well. Will we let them choose to be in community with us? What comes to mind for many modern citizens if I ask these kinds of questions will be examples like elephants in Africa. But since we're in North America, that's a rather removed example. Our fellow great apes, all native to other places, other charismatic megafauna like tigers and lions and rhinos, maybe whooping cranes going over polar bears. These are extraordinary living beings, and surely they come within the others. But let's bring it closer to the abilities that everybody brought into the room. We live amidst wildlife. There are local, other than human lives on this campus. There are local non-human lives in our backyards, on the roads we travel, in any wood or field you travel by, in the interstices of our cities. Wonderful work done in geography on urban animals. Not just our pets, but the non-domesticated animals that live in the strange places. Many, many, many different kinds of small mammals, certainly birds as well. The description, as Amy read out, of this panel notes that in the last years we've had a shift in this perception of wildlife, in our perception of wildlife in this industrialized society, and that maybe they can live independent of us. And as David will lay out, well, as we might say, the legal system rather imperfectly reflects our ability to do good community with them. But I think the panel description does a nice job of pointing out one of the sources, and that's what's called the Traditional Hunting Conservation Management course, which is one way we've conceptualized wildlife, for example, in our state agencies, which are often set up for the advantage of hunting, but not for the survival of all kinds, but only the sort of prized hunting targets. And that sort of wildlife management is rather bankrupt. So what we're interested in doing in the panel is fostering a discussion of, as it says, wildlife within the rights paradigm. Before I turn you over to David, I'm going to focus focus specifically on law. Let me underscore 3 things and then conclude. Even though ethical duties involve rights in common parlance, it remains a constant challenge for us to pick out what's the adjective in front of rights. And as the excerpt that's provided as part of the readings from my 2011 book points out, there are moral rights which come out of certain kinds of conceptuality quite distinct from our specific legal rights. And using an adjective in front of the word rights will often help you clarify. The term animal rights sits all across that spectrum around the world. Most often around the world used for moral rights, but in our society, litigious as we are, legal rights has often become the dominant sense of animal rights. But around the world, it means often just treat them okay, come on. Second, at this point, it's relevant to suggest that it is important to know the academic theories, deontology, virtue ethics, utilitarianism. There are materials on that. That's the way that policymaking circles discuss this stuff. So I teach my students know this stuff. It's the lingo. It's the discourse that dominates how people think about this in policymaking circles. But something far more important, and this is the third of these 3 points, notice wildlife in our daily lives. Notice it in your life, I notice it in mine, because that's where our ethics towards wildlife play out. It's where our ethics live, if you want to say it that way. One of the things I like to do is just follow a young child out into the more than human world and watch her. Watch how naturally fascinated she is with the non-human lives she encounters. It's a great, great experience. Some will scare her, the snakes. We're natively fearful of snakes. But they are rather marvelous if you get close to them and get past that. But most of those non-humans she encounters will invite her, and they'll invite you, they'll invite me as well, if I just let them do that. And that's really part of the fascination of wildlife, is it brings us to the more than human world. It's not just other than human animals, there's a more than human world out there, but we so dominate it with our human exceptionalism, evidenced by the way law divides the universe up into human persons and legal things. Legal persons and legal things. So pay attention to our children. They can teach us a great deal about the world, especially about the natural fascination and invitation that comes from local wildlife. So I want to suggest to you that the mere suggestion of ethics in wildlife has this incredibly beautiful human side to it. Much of this is explored outside of animal law circles, as in the highly interdisciplinary approach called animal studies, which takes a look at odd subjects like literature and animals, religion and animals, geography and animals, sociology and animals, history and animals. These are vibrant debates in the world today. And also the way other cultures have kept this as part of their heartbeat in daily life. But we're removed often, and we don't even recognize that we have neighbors who happen to be non-humans in our local world virtually all the time. There's also a great deal of this kind of wisdom available in environmentally focused approaches, although all of us know that some environmentally focused approaches are extremely inhospitable to animal law work, or animal rights work, as it were. And the key here is, how do we make sure that we constantly bridge that? That's a valuable orientation on the world. We do live in larger ecosystems just as we have non-human neighbors, and in fact, that's a shared home for us. And there are all kinds of academic disciplines today turning to the fact that this is a rich, complex intersection which we need every single human capability to explore. But I think particularly relevant from animal law is that we need to export the astonishing success of animal law in legal education, but also if you just looked around and see who's here and the caliber of people, how really important the human side, the human capacity is for caring as evidenced in animal law. Kathy Hassler also did a wonderful thing in that factory farm panel. She talked about how many humans are disadvantaged. And that's something to keep totally in our awareness as we look at protecting non-human animals. So in conclusion, let me exhort myself, all of us, to see wildlife problems in terms of more than legal categories. We need those. They guide us. It's an important, privileged sort of discourse in the world, but it can be stark. And there is a way to enrich it and our own personal understanding by instead working with a synthesis of personal values, ethical guidelines drawn from our daily lives and the awareness that we garner from following children in the world, and many other human cultures as well. And also savviness about how legal concepts are employed, often to create the very oppressions that we now are trying to demolish with legal tools. Law is powerful, but a very complex element. I'll suggest to you that it is an absolutely essential component. It's the leading edge of contemporary animal studies, but it's just one of them. It's as if we need a group, animal law being in the front ranks, but flanked by some of the really profoundly human elements in our arts, in our sociology, in our history, in our spiritual awareness. There are multifaceted ways that humans get to this, law being a leading one, but not the only one. Thanks very much.
Well, it does seem like I've been sort of introduced to everybody. One additional aspect I would like to bring that has some relevance here to what Paul was just talking about is that for the past dozen or so years, I've lived on a farm, and we now actively have Icelandic sheep and Icelandic chickens and llamas and a large number of animals, which has informed my scholarship on the domestic animal side, clearly. But also, I live with wildlife. I mean, it's not hidden away on some pigeon on a roof. Every day, I have wildlife, and I thoroughly enjoy that. It's just marvelous to be able to share that. But you didn't talk about the conflicts that occur when that wildlife comes in to kill your chickens. And some of the reality is we have it, all wildlife is welcome everywhere except right here. We draw little lines. They can't come in the barn, they can't come in the house, and if they do, we got problems. I'm going to be talking primarily from an article I wrote entitled Wildlife Rights, which is among the materials available, and I just happen to bring 2 hard copies for those of you that don't want to deal with the digital age. I'm happy to share. Also want to put in just a quick PR note for the second Global Animal Law Conference that I'm helping organize along with Pam Frosch and in Barcelona next July 12th, and I hope some of you might be able to come. It should be a rather amazing conference. I also think that I'm going to do a little bit of ethics to get you to where I'm thinking so that then I'll move into law, okay? I also agree that a concept that is useful is community with wildlife, that we share something together. But what I share with the raccoons on my farm is different than what I share with the elephants in the Serengeti, okay? And my ethical issues there are very different in how I weigh and think about those sorts of things. So it is a complex world. Some of my initial thoughts are wildlife here that I want to talk about is the wildlife that's not human property. In other words, I'm not going to talk about wildlife in the zoo. That's a fascinating area, but that's not what I'm doing here. We do share ethical communities. They are ethical subjects in my mind. We don't need to kick that around anymore. How are we alike and different? When people start to talk about ethics in animals and law and animal rights, it's not unusual to have somebody say, well, how smart are they? Or how much like humans are they? And I really have gotten to the point where, let's don't go there. It's not relevant. It's simply not relevant. I do still have a lot of confusion. I don't use the phrase animal rights because it's meaningless. It is totally meaningless. You go ask my neighbor who's a hunter what animal rights mean, and you might shoot me. I don't know. You ask somebody on the street what it means, everybody has a cluster, somewhat PETA-driven perhaps, about what animal rights is, and is it ethics, is it law? We're total confusion, so we just don't talk about it. This is clearly unethical and illegal. Chopping off rhino horns. I think that's a judgment a lot of people can pretty easily make, but apparently there's several 100,000 to 1 million people in the Middle East who judge that differently and believe that it is ethical to kill a rhino to have the product of rhino horn to help their medical and assorted other needs. I have worked, and I'm working on a book right now that does this in some detail, where I've come to a summary, the bumper sticker for how I think about animals broadly, not just wildlife. And that is, my construct is animal-human interactions shall only occur on the basis of respectful use. And I'd like to resurrect that phrase. Yeah. You're telling a professor to stay in one place. That's just hard. Okay. For wildlife in particular, what do we want is our goal. And I have something I just sort of suggest here, to live a natural life as possible in order that the animal can experience life as fully as possible, given his or her inherent interest and capabilities, the opportunity to be themselves. And of course, you must understand that wildlife in the wild can be short and brutal and bloody and cruel. And they can be cruel. Animals do seem to, some animals intentionally harm other animals for other than eating. What might respect mean? Well, that's a whole chapter in my book. Acknowledgement of the other being, that's the threshold. Is this a being, right? And then seeking to understand that being, and then changing your conduct to accommodate that being, primarily focusing on the health and well-being of the other. And a lot of people in the animal movement would like to have bright lines, rules. Boom, you can do this, you can't do that. I just don't find life that open to bright line tests. And when we deal with animals, I think we have to acknowledge that we are always on the slippery slope. We are always balancing our interest versus their interest. And just get over it. That's where you are. And when you make a statement, somebody's going to tell you about mosquitoes in South Africa and that therefore your hypothetical is wrong. And I just say, well, go to hell. If you want to take off about, you've missed my entire point if you want to take it to some weird place like mosquitoes in South Africa. But let's give some thought to who balances. Humans and animal interests are going to be in counterbalance. And it's very important to understand who is doing the balancing. Well, we have private parties doing that. That's you and I, individuals, organizations, and corporations. Okay? And that's where ethics come into play, we hope, for us. We make ethical balancing points. Corporations, maybe not. Maybe it's an economic balancing point that weighs the balance for them. But then we also have the public balancing, which is called law. And who does that? Well, the legislature does it, administrative, executive branches do it, and the judge and the jury do it. We've got 3 places where we balance the interest. And those are different, you're all lawyers and law students, so you understand, I hope at this point, how different those 3 different things are. Also think about, and this is one of the things I would like to tease apart for people, is have a clear sense in your mind the difference between ethics, your ethics, and law, all right? They're very different. Ethics seeks to engage an individual and their conduct towards others, where the law is often silent. Ethics is to give you a whole life view. The law is not there to give you a life view. I do not want the law to tell me how I should run my life. In fact, we try in the United States to minimize the interference with running our lives from the law, but each year it seems to get a little more complex. That's Henry Berg. It's unusual that an area of law can look to one person that crystallizes the transformation of a perception from social views into the law itself. And he was the originator of the ASPCA in New York City and was the obtainer of the first anti-cruelty law, as we understand it today. This is from 1867 and represents the structure that still exists in any number of our state cruelty laws. And I want you to look at this from a sort of a geological checking, going back in time, and what not just what are those words, what do those words suggest? What supports those words? And we see overdrive, overlord, torture, torment, deprive of substance, unnecessarily or cruelly beat, or needlessly mutilate or kill any living creature. That the statute has the phrase any living creature in it is, oh my God, that's breathtaking. That's the first time anybody had said that. Did he really mean it? Did the New York legislature in 1867 really mean jellyfishes are to be given protection from anti-cruelty? No, I don't think so. But that's just the scope of his vision of what needed to happen. He was bringing his philosophy to this. And what does this represent? The key is unnecessarily. It's my view that that is the American cultural tradition coming out of the Judeo-Christian religions, and that is you may use an animal, but you may not unnecessarily cause pain and suffering to an animal. And I really would, no. Don't we accept that as sort of a premise? And don't even our neighbors accept that as a premise? We don't have neighbors that say, I'm going to go out and do something cruel. That really is part of our culture. One of my shocks was when I went to Japan for one time and started talking to people, I found out, well, that's not the culture everywhere in the world. It really is a reflection of us that we have this cultural start point. And he transformed it into law. And there's two things there about the law. First one, overdrive, overload. That was a political reality of the time, and that was horses were what got it through politically. Care about the horses that would die on the streets of New York City. And therefore, the first thing that's illegal on the first cruelty law is that you can't overload a horse. But then, so that's a specific thing. But then the fudgy one is unnecessarily. How do you know if something's unnecessarily? For this law, you go to a jury. And how does a jury decide if it's unnecessary? They're balancing their sense of the world, the horse interest versus the human interest. It's that balancing act, and it occurs in the complex minds of 12 or 6 jurors, and that's how our society has been defining the cruelty law ever since. Test, target, Bambi. There are clearly people that have all three visions of this particular animal. It might depend on where it is. We run into the largest conflicts when the deer occur in relatively small parks, and the animal rights people want to protect every deer to the last drop, and the environmentalists say you've got to kill some of the deer because the deer are eating the whole park up. And that's a place I don't get in the middle of those because you're not going to win that one. Did the deer have any rights? The humans are arguing about it. What about the deer? Does the deer have any rights? Well, what's a right? And we need to think about that. And I think one of the things I have tried to bring to legal scholarship is to suggest to you that that's really a layered question, and that rights can mean a lot of different things. And if we will be more sophisticated about how we think about rights, we can declare some animals have some rights, even if they're property. Of course, wildlife aren't property, so we don't run into that disconnect here. I've come up with several principles that I think would inform the legal discussion about animals. Wildlife shall not be unnecessarily harmed, captured, or killed. Okay? And I'm using that's the word we're comfortable with, unnecessary. So put it up there. If wildlife are to be harmed, captured, or killed, method used must not inflict unnecessary pain and suffering. I know it's a fudge phrase, but that's what it is. Wildlife shall have habitat sufficient to support their life, a necessity, obviously, and that's actually fairly controversial. Wildlife should be deemed capable of holding equitable interest in property. I would like for wildlife to conceptually have a property interest in the places they live, because that would give them leverage in the legal system, right? If you can have a legal interest, then you're somebody. So we got to do it. We got to get wildlife interest. And then 5, humans have an affirmative duty to maximize biodiversity. This is a new thing. And that is, historically, it's sort of been vis-a-vis wildlife as well. We just will stop doing things and they'll be okay. And it's pretty clear on this globe now, we're killing so many animals and so much habitat on such a regular basis that even if we stop right now, it's too late for any number of things. And that we'd actually have an affirmative duty to go back and recreate sufficient habitat. Beautiful North American animal. Does it have a right to life? Apparently not. Leg hole traps capture these on a regular basis. They're caught in a majority of the states in the United States. About 4,000 or so every year are killed for the purpose of fashion. They're not an endangered species. They receive no protection under the endangered species law. So, what is a necessary use? I suspect everybody in this room would say that's not necessary. We shouldn't kill to make fur coats. That's an insufficient human justification. It's a legal right when the right is acknowledged, when the interest of an animal is acknowledged within the legal context. That's the threshold. And it's then given some weight in the decision making, and the outcome will flow to those animals. That's when you know you have a right. You're acknowledged, you're considered, and you're given some consideration in the remedy. Too many people focus on this, the golden prize, personhood for wildlife. They should be legal people just like us. Steve and I have been talking about this for 20 years, Steve Wise. Okay, that's the golden prize, but there's so much you can do before that. I say there's the one way to think, I'm going to give you a construct to think about things. I can't give you all the answers today. I would suggest to you the 3 levels or categories of people that are plaintiffs who can bring forth something for the interest of animals. The government, private enforcement, and self-enforcement. We had a whole panel that talked about the North Carolina statute. That's private enforcement. And private enforcement can be more powerful than government enforcement because we know the government sometimes decides not to enforce things, right? But all the cruelty laws are government enforced. And clearly, it's not quite a right because the interest of the animal comes forward, but the process really doesn't help the animal, right? It's punishment to the human. It's not really helping the animal. We've tried to get statutes that do take into account the actual animal that's part of the cruelty thing. But like the examples we saw in North Carolina, that was, the bear was the focus point. The bear got the benefit of the lawsuit. So the bear's interest was in the system. But we need to understand that wildlife we can't always have an individual known, although we do know some individual whales and other animals, but we also group by species and ecosystem. So I've created this grid, and this grid is in the written materials. And if you want to do something for wildlife, look at this grid and think about it and say, well, where could I do something? You know, where's a place? So you can see, I need new glasses. Anti-cruelty laws are weak because they're only government enforced. Number 4, they're stronger if in North Carolina, if every state, the most important thing we could do for animals in the next 10 days, right? And the next 10 years is that every state could adopt a statute like North Carolina's. I think it would be just an amazing threshold. Understand the role of the Endangered Species Act here in that it does take into account the interest of species in very powerful ways. Remedies do flow to the interest of the species that you're talking about. I'd also would like to point out that long ago and far away, Justice Douglas in Sierra Club versus Morton had his famous dissent in which he argued for the acknowledgement of area to be plaintiffs so that they may represent their interest against those that seek to destroy them. And that was bolstered by the book, Should Trees Have Standing? And I'm bringing that back. I'd like to talk about that again, where you can have strong rights, NEPA, citizen suits. That one, box number 6, is basically Sierra Club versus Morton. Well, I put it in 6 too. I've got some other things, but I'm going to run out of time. Trust law, look at that, because wildlife can be trust beneficiaries in some states. You didn't know that? Check it out. Oh, I got one thing to show you. Home. My proposed constitutional amendment, right? We're going to go crazy. We should go all the way. All wildlife of the classification mammal, bird, and amphibian, and reptile, I'm drawing a line because we've got to be a little bit real, shall have the right to their natural life. No law shall be implemented or agency decision made that deprives any wildlife of life, liberty, or habitat without due process of law. Wildlife, as defined above, should be considered self-owned and may hold equitable title and property. Just sort of slipping in somewhere.
We can open up to questions now. Please come down to the microphones.
Hey, this question is primarily for David. It's a comment, then a question. Kind of showing this kind of schizophrenia of how we react to wildlife. I mentioned yesterday in Sonoma County, we're trying to get rid of the Wildlife Services contract. And we've got a Sonoma County Wildlife Rescue who in the previous 3 years have rescued, you mentioned bobcats, 41 bobcats at the same, and it's subsidized pretty heavily by the county. At the same time, the county paid Wildlife Services to kill 45 bobcats. So you've got this almost like canceling out and paying for both sides. It just shows the kind of schizophrenic approach to it. But my question is, I got sort of an email yesterday about one of the safari club groups is auctioning off the ability to kill a black rhino for $1 million. And they're claiming this $1 million is going to go straight towards sort of habitat and into Africa and to survive. And it's just such this insidious thing. I just wonder how you kind of react to that.
It depends on if you want to be a purist or if you want to be a pragmatic. The purist in North America can sit there and say, oh, that's a terrible thing. It shouldn't be worth $1 million, you know. But if what they say is true, that it actually would go to on-ground activities, $1 million is a lot of money in Africa. It could make a lot of good things happen. So I don't like that idea of using animals. Well, you have to sort of divide the world. What do you think about sport hunting as a first step? And then you talk, well, what about turning it into an auction for the benefit? And sport hunting is, I've dealt with that a number of times. I have lots of friends that are hunters, and I don't enter into any discussions with people about hunting because it's just not fruitful. My position is that to kill for pleasure or adrenaline is unethical. But why people kill in sport hunting is much more complex than that. So I can't get into their heads. I can't figure out for each person what they do. I just state my position. So the idea of shooting the rhino is repulsive because it's blood, it's death to us, and it's big and it's, you know, and important. Yeah, but if that could, you know how many guards that would pay for, and how many Jeeps that would pay for, and maybe a helicopter ride or two, and you know, can they get radios that actually help intercept the poachers, and can you build a jail to keep these people in, and you know, so. Let me tell you, in Africa, the idea of money to preserve wildlife is right there. It is in your face because their value system in Africa just doesn't accommodate wildlife like we do here. We have an inherent ability to say wildlife is good, because most of you haven't had wildlife do anything bad to you. But wildlife in Africa does bad things, right? It destroys crops. And there, if you destroy a crop, that means somebody's going to starve. I mean, wildlife is much more difficult to deal with in Africa than it is here. So be very cautious about taking your North American view to Africa. I don't find any easy answers there at all.
A couple observations. Utilitarian calculations are used all the time, and David runs through them, and there are some profoundly important insights that you could use the $1 million in a helpful way. If we were looking at species-level realities, great. I'm glad to live in a democratic society because I would lobby so hard against that and speak against it constantly, but I would have to relent if the public voted for that to say it's a condition of me being in the society that I would have to say, well, all right, that's a system, but let me have a second chance and I'll be even more vociferous if possible. So to me, there is a way in which I'd want to oppose it, but I'd also recognize it's just not up to me as one voter, it's up to us as a group. But I think there are profoundly important reasons not to do it, and those are the kinds of things I would advocate, but then again, all of us have to yield in this system.
Hi, excuse me. Thank you, guys. My name is David. I'm a student at Brooklyn Law School. I also do a lot of urban wildlife work in New York City. USDA Wildlife Services, while we don't have predators in New York City, goes after other pest animals that are overpopulated. And I guess I have two questions for you guys, and I'll try to keep it simple because you raise a lot of ideas in my mind. So the first is you're talking about balancing the interests between humans and wildlife, but it seems like human interests keep expanding. And we talk about obligation to create wildlife refuges in other areas, but I'm just kind of troubled by the extent to which we keep spreading out and our interests just keep growing and moving and expanding. And then the other question I have is in terms of advocating and taking on some of the efforts to remove wildlife is like, there's a lot of loaded words like invasive species and overpopulation, and like, is that something that can be confronted best through the law, or is that something that's science-based, or is that something that just needs to be approached from like a social, approach?
One of the most profound things we could do for wildlife is to move 1 billion people to Mars. There are too many humans, and you're absolutely right. If you say each human has a right to interfere a certain amount with the world around them to take care of themselves, well, if you add 1 billion people, even if that's a modest footprint, it's still a huge footprint on a global scale. So people don't want to talk about population control, human rights, ability to choose your own family, but it is seriously impacting wildlife on a global basis.
At 2010 conference we did at Harvard on the future of animal law, I did a paper about second wave animal law. And I think this question raises those issues. Second wave animal law I see as an enriched phenomenon. It's based on the parallel to second wave feminism, third wave, now even a fourth wave of feminism. But where animal law goes and gets resources outside of law to help us deepen our perspective. This is a great tool. It should be used wisely. What it means to use it wisely often means tapping into spiritual traditions or traditions of compassion or traditions that are outside the law. So I think in some senses it's a question of trying to find the perspectives that help us see that we have expanded. There's a wonderful book by Richard Louv called Last Child in the Woods about the dramatic impoverishment of children who do not get to be in the natural world. Impoverishment of their cognitive abilities. Not just, I live in a culture that's bad, their own cognitive abilities, because we grew up in worlds where our cognitive abilities were stimulated by other living beings. In order for us to be as rich and amazing as we are, one, humble, two, in the presence of others, humans and non-human others. So you can see where that's going is like, the expansion is troubling, but go back to the fact that this is a balancing act constantly, and we're going to have an increasing population for a while. And we got to deal with that and respect the humans who come along, and at the same time, try to find ways to say, there is room in our larger community for other living beings as well. And let's see, how do we do that? Animal law is certainly leading the way. It just needs other allies in the second wave to help with that vision.
You are touching on this a little bit already, Professor Waldow, but you spoke about how the adjective before rights matters. And I'm wondering what, in societies like the United States, where legal rights become more prevalent in the discourse, whether legal rights displace moral rights or set a foundation upon which moral rights can be built. And what lessons does that have for a lawyer who still retains that childlike fascination with animals.
It's great. Janet, come and do the program and do that as a sort of, I run a special capstone seminar where you get to do a research question. Do that, believe me. This is an incredibly rich question that would take us, this seminar, I get to talk with them twice a week for 15 weeks. And so we would build the answer to that. That's an incredible question. I don't think it displaces it. For example, think of the Brand case in Vermont, where the law does allow people to dispose of their property, of course, through wills. And so the guy decides that he wants to kill his horses, and in Chittenden County, the executor happens to go to court, and they say, no, it's against public policy. It's like, wait a minute. What do you mean it's against public policy? When he's alive, he can kill the horses. What does it mean? But it was a kind of a fiction used, but a beautiful one, tapping into the underlying notion all of us have that, yeah, something really wasteful about that. Okay, that's a set of social values that are there that the law has not eclipsed, but it comes close, doesn't it, David? I mean, the law, you gave a beautiful description of the fact it's not about us personal meaning, it's about society trying to get some regulation here, sometimes wonderful stuff, sometimes horrifically ugly about who you can marry and what race gets to get in the front of the bus, just insanely stupid uses of law. However, law is still powerful and good at times. There.
But law, I think law follows ethics. I think the ethics have to exist, and then you create the law. And the ethics are best practices, and the law is minimally acceptable practices. And we must understand we can't implement our ethical view because it's a best practice, and we must find a acceptable level of minimal practices and use that for the legal system.
I think that's a nice view, and I think it happens in the best circumstances. Unfortunately, I'd say 2/3 of our law has not been that. But
Oh, well.
where it's like who you can own is because they're the wrong color, or just it's been done traditionally. I mean, I think law is the source of many of these oppressions, but we have the great advantage of being in an educational and political system that allows us to ask these questions and then use the tools that you described in the way you described, David. I mean, there is hope inside of law. All of us know that. It's just that sometimes it's hanging by this perilously thin string. Like, but nonetheless, but let's stay with that. I don't ever want to lose the beautiful idealism that drives that, because that's what animal law is taking advantage of.
Hi, my name is Jill Buckley, and I work for the ASPCA. And I just have a comment and an illustration of what we've been talking about. I happen to live on a golf course on the central coast of California, and it is also a bird sanctuary. And apparently, it's an Audubon bird sanctuary, but unfortunately, there are apparently certain birds that don't fall under that sanctuary because the golfers hate coots. And they hate the coots because the coots poop on the greens. And I understand that, and I totally get it, but they kill the coots, and they come out with their guns, and they shoot them. And so, of course, I don't like that, so I've come up to the golf course, and they go, God, here she comes again, trying to get them to use some sort of non-lethal means to get rid of these coots. And thus far, I haven't had a whole lot of success. And unfortunately, there's also a little bit of fear on my part because these folks have guns and I have animals. So just sort of an illustration of we've moved into this beautiful place that attracts these birds, and now we want to kill them, so.
I don't know what to say.
Can I tell?
That's a great dilemma.
I thought one of the marvelous panels here was the alternatives thing. Notice we put aside the ethical discussion. Like, no. My father wants to eat mayonnaise. He doesn't care where it comes from. Just outcompete the present source of mayonnaise using eggs, that's an ugly process. Outcompete them on price and health. And certainly it has to be as good a product. So I was talking to my wife about this. She said, I told you a long time ago that's what should happen. But the key was that you had these incredibly bright, motivated individuals who work in the system and the venture capital and are extraordinarily powerful, sometimes misguided, capitalism, but very powerful. We're all beneficiaries. In a way that said, I thought for the first time, there's hope. There's hope for dismantling the system just by flanking it on the values that got it created. I thought, that's cool. I don't need ethical discourse for people who are that clever, because remember the guy who said, Well, you can go to the CEO of the company and talk the humane stuff, but he isn't going to market on it. I'm thinking, okay, so ethics is there. It's just that, okay, in the American public, the ethics isn't going to sell. What's going to sell is the price and the health, et cetera. Thought, I'm perfectly on board with that because ethics still remains a component. It was a beautiful exemplification. So now, can you get those entrepreneurs to come up with the kind of devices that chase the coots away in a harmless way, and people get to golf on that space that used to be coot space or whatever, okay? Maybe, but that's pretty low priority compared to us getting cheeses that don't have oppression as an ingredient.
Last question.
Hi, I'm Janet Jones-Stephanie. I'm from Columbia Law School, the SALDF there. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the presence of other ethical considerations when discussing animal issues. I find that in a lot of conversations I've had, those tend to sort of be set aside and animal issues are approached in a box. For instance, I've had some people defend the chinchilla fur industry on the basis that, oh, they can no longer survive in the wild and this industry is now sustaining the population. And I just wonder about things like, we all sort of, most people broadly accept the idea of personal responsibility. If you break it, you fix it. And in a lot of these balancing questions, it seems like the past history and human contributions to the problems are sometimes set aside, and we just look at present values and sort of cast off other ethical considerations. So I was just wondering how you see other things coming into that dialogue.
Two thoughts. One is that science is doing an amazing job of helping enrich our understanding of what are the interests of these other animals. And the more details they can bring forward, the more real that interest is, and the harder it is for people to dismiss it. But the other point about balancing is that it's on the slippery slope. And you're right, the balancing has as part of its balance is, well, how much weight do you give to an interest? And history is a pretty big, your family history, your cultural history will say a lot about how much weight you give to a particular activity. How important it is that you have bullfights. Well, in Spain, that's a debate. I mean, that's a real in-the-bar debate. In the U.S., no. Why do you need to kill a bull to have entertainment? We've set that one aside. Well, we're both the same human beings, but it's in the cultural context and the weight given to the interest of the individual conflict. And your fact patterns would take us on for hours.
And two wonderful elements. David mentioned science, critically important input. You need to be scientifically literate in the sense of knowing the basics about who these other individuals are if you want to be ethical. How do we know what our impacts are? Go get some of the best information available, and science does that. But there's another point in the balancing. The saying that the perfect is the enemy of the good. We live in a polarized society, and we're on the margins trying to advocate for marginalized animals. So when you go into court, you dress well, you articulate, you show, I know the system, and I'm playing it to the advantage of my clients, namely the non-humans. But in the polarized debate, the ones who are on the outside have an extra burden of creating the culture of the very possibility of talking. Because guess what? Once we talk, we've got a chance for the non-human animals to be appreciated. The science, great stuff, et cetera. The ethical abilities that I talked about. But the polarized environment means you don't get perfection, you don't get abolition, you really have to stage things in. They can be tragic, but that's the way it is. It is a practical problem, not a theoretical problem of perfection. You should just think as I do. It's like, well, maybe. But the point is the practical point of getting it better, and our job is to lurch this forward, inch it forward, whatever it takes to get it done. And I think that we're quite skilled as lawyers, eminently practical animals, ultimately. Yes. And animal law is brokering that with mad passion behind it. And that's ethics, but it's like, but our technique is flawlessly good in terms of technicalities.
That's it. Thanks, everyone.